On March 21st, 2020, Hawaii imposed a COVID travel quarantine and the state went into lockdown. Tourism was wiped out, the economy tanked, jobs disappeared. For the first time ever, many were forced to line up for food to keep their families fed. Waves of panic buying and hoarding stripped supermarket shelves. And yet, the daily food supply that we completely take for granted seemed to hold up. In fact, behind the scenes as the virus tore through the nation's supply chain, Hawaii's distribution professionals frantically scrambled as our fragile food pipeline fractured and began to shut down. Anyone who calls this remote island chain home and thinks feeding their family is important deserves to know just how perilously close we all came to real hunger, and how that same threat constantly hangs over us.
My name is Chad Buck, and I'm the owner of Hawaii Food Service Alliance. We're the state's largest supplier of highly perishable products to the grocers, clubs, retailers across all islands. We're in every grocer, every club, every retailer, every day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. We have operations on all major islands, and our full-time job, 365 days a year, is keeping Hawaii fed. Hawaii imports about 95% of all that we eat here comes from the mainland. We were watching COVID kind of roll through the mainland starting in February, and by the time February was coming to an end, we were sending notes out to our customers and others as far as trying to get an understanding of what they're doing to prepare for what's about to hit Hawaii. And so we saw tremendous hoarding going into place across all islands simultaneously. And that panic mode that people were hitting, that put strain on the food chain and the food supply chain coming into the grocers, clubs, and retailers. And what was unique about this time, so we're very versed in a tsunami warning and what happens in that 24-hour period where everybody's going crazy and hoarding and trying to get as much product as they can into their homes. We're also very versed in when a hurricane comes into Hawaii. We're watching the hurricanes come across the Pacific, and so everybody's kind of dialing in a little bit. And then day, 2 days out, things go crazy. The stores get wiped out of product as everybody kind of goes into survival mode for a hurricane. What was unique about COVID is there's 3,000 something counties across the U.S. There's 19,000 plus cities across the U.S. And every city, every county, every state was having a tsunami or a hurricane of their own. What we were witnessing is the supply chains that in a hurricane, we're the only one going through it, and so everybody's kind of supplying and coming up to, and helping us deal with whatever we need to deal with. With COVID, everybody was on their own. Arizona was trying to take care of Arizona. California's taking care of California. The chains, the grocery store chains, the national chains, they had stress across all states, all counties, all cities. And so Hawaii was literally the first time in Hawaii's history we found ourselves just completely stripped of support. I mean, the first 5 months of COVID, I was on the job 7 days a week for 5 months straight because of the strain that it was putting on the supply chains. We had suppliers that literally, through years of relationship building, decades of relationship building, the only reason why Hawaii was eating in some areas is because we had family-owned suppliers throughout the West Coast in Arizona that chose to give Hawaii product when it could have easily gone to their neighbor. Because of all the hoarding that was going on, they chose to allow us to go over our typical history of purchases with them and spike that, in some cases, over 200%. And so those containers continued to come. We had national chains asking us how we were still in stock in Hawaii while they were out across the West Coast and across the mainland. We typically live about 2 to 3 weeks ahead of today because of what's going on in the supply chains. And so the actions that our buying team is taking today are for what's going to happen 2 to 3 weeks out. And so we were watching what was going on there. We were watching COVID infect the meat supply places, the egg farms, the dairy farms, the manufacturing side, the bakeries, all the food industry and manufacturing was getting impacted as COVID rolled through their workplace. And people were out, they couldn't make the product that they typically show up to produce. We got kind of a front row line of sight into what was happening and just started really trying to hunker down and prepare for what was about to come. One, we're the largest handler of fresh produce and vegetables and so on, air freight coming into the state. So we're bringing in millions and millions of pounds of cargo. And in order to get that product here, we ride on literally every airline that flies out of LAX to Hawaii every day. And so whether it's United, it's Delta, it's Aloha Cargo, Pac Air, Hawaiian Airlines, every one of those airlines carries our product to come into the state. And so as the tourists stopped coming and airlines started shutting down their routes to Hawaii, our supply chain, our ability to fly product into the state evaporated. And so there was no longer any lift coming out of LA. And so we were looking for all types of ways anyway, whether we truck it up to Vegas or whatever. I think what most people don't understand or may not understand or have a line of sight to is LAX is the main supply into Hawaii because there's more flights coming out of LAX to Hawaii than any other place. However, Hawaii goes through seasons that we literally don't have enough lift on every airline coming into Hawaii. So once we max out the capacity and we still have more product to go, there's certain seasons that we'll start trucking down the excess to San Diego. We'll start trucking up to San Francisco to fly product to Hawaii. And sometimes San Diego, LAX, and San Francisco don't have enough lift to feed Hawaii, so we start trucking to Vegas. And so when all those flights stopped, our appetites or the need for food in Hawaii didn't stop. The clubs, the retailers, the grocers still needed that product to feed the population here. And so that caused us to work with cargo carriers and literally book the entire plane. It was a mad scramble to try to find enough lift across the West Coast to be able to supply us. You know, we're used to running around the clock, but with huge spikes in volume because of the hoarding that was going on and because of the need of what was happening with COVID, there was significant concern whether the farms were going to continue to be able to supply, whether COVID was going to knock out their workforce. We were just kind of holding our breath every time we'd get a call from one of our suppliers because as COVID was rolling through their workplace, we weren't sure if they'd even be able to fill our orders. And as you know, California was kind of going through all kinds of hell during the rollout of COVID and everything that was going on. So these lockdown orders were coming in. We've never been in this space before. Our staff's calling me from California saying, hey, they're telling us to stay at home. We're not going to be able to load containers. And I said, well, if we stay at home, Hawaii doesn't eat. That's not an option. If I need to get a hold of whoever I need to get a hold of here to reach out to the California government to allow us to continue to operate, we're going to do whatever we can and whatever we need to, because if we stop, Hawaii stops eating. You can't watch, you can't participate in this industry without taking a look at what's going on and wonder, why on God's green earth is this not grown here? I mean, it's spinach, it's lettuce, it's kale. It's all the stuff that could easily be grown here, and we, for some reason, have decided not to. The more you look at it, the more you realize that Hawaii has never taken ag seriously, ever, except for sugarcane and pineapple, which we can't eat here so much, right? So in all of Hawaii's history, since statehood, Hawaii has never been serious about agriculture, never been serious about feeding our own people with food grown by our own hands, being kind of front and center of the distribution side. And you watch what Hawaii's done, and you watch what we've basically chosen not to do. And then COVID comes along, and it is a massive wake-up call that we have taken a wrong turn somewhere a long, long time ago, and we have never cared about sustaining our own people with our own food grown with our own hands. We're the most isolated geographic area on planet Earth, yet we decided, someone made a decision, and everybody went along with it a while ago, a long time ago, decades ago, that we're just not going to feed our own people. And that is insanity. We have to, absolutely have to, start growing our own food and becoming sustainable on our own. As the most isolated geographic area on planet Earth, it makes absolutely no sense to not be sustainable. There's not a soul in Hawaii who lives here that has lived through COVID over the last year that hasn't walked into a grocery store aisle and see the shelves just completely bare. If you want to get a wake-up call, try going to the grocery store and not knowing if you're going to be able to bring food back to your family. I'm hoping that this shock of seeing that and living through that and going through that as a state and as a people, that we will, for the first time in our history, take agriculture seriously.
So it's 2019. I've just finished a conversation with David Lopez at the Hawaii Emergency Management Agency, and I invited David into a conversation at the Hawaii Agricultural Conference. And I thought it was critical to bring Chad Buck into this conversation as one of the largest food distributors in the state of Hawaii and pair him with the emergency management agencies at the city, county, state, and federal level.
You know, there's some things that happen in your life where you can always point to them and say, that's the moment I changed, or that's the moment, that was the shift in my thinking. And that moment on that day at the convention center, as he showed an overview of Hurricane Lane, whose path was bigger than our entire chain, David Lopez said,
Hurricane Lane was of particular worry because it was parked off our south shore, and especially off of Oahu. Oahu contains on its south shore, within the same 10, 12 miles of coastline, major infrastructure that either directly or indirectly affects the whole state. The Port of Honolulu, Pearl Harbor, oil refinery, wastewater treatment plants, food storage, fuel storage, the offshore mooring points to pump the crude in so it can be refined. If Lane would have hit us at a Category 5, we're looking at storm surge anywhere from 8 to 20 feet and possibly even more. And every piece of infrastructure that I just named would be in that inundation zone. It would be affected. Probably on impact, we'd lose our power grid. 60% of our big electric plants are in inundation zones, and roughly about 7,000 miles of overhead power lines. No electricity then would mean we can't operate gantry cranes, we can't pump water up to the reservoir tanks for residential drinking. Even in high rises, we're not going to be able to pump water up for them either. Airport, easily we would have had inundation to the terminal, which meant for H&L we would have lost all 4 runways. When we look at other importation, especially through our sea chain, food comes to mind right away because we import about 90% of all our food products. And when we lose the port, a storm like Hurricane Lane shuts down approximately 2 days before, roughly, the storm actually strikes for safety reasons. So we lose our importation, which means we're starting to consume our emergency supplies. You combine that too with there's runs on the market, and our food supply is rapidly being reduced above normal rates. Once that storm hits, that means probably about 2 days after the storm, our market is down well below 40% of its normal capacity, and we're drinking ketchup and eating M&Ms.
And I'm like, no frickin' way. That can't be true. This is the state head of HIEMA talking to a group at the convention center. It's like someone sucked the oxygen out of the room. Everything goes dead quiet.
Many people hadn't actually considered that it is possible for us to run out of food in the case of a severe natural disaster.
I thought, assumed that there was an adult somewhere in the state of Hawaii that was watching over us. You know, we can set our calendars by when the hurricanes start coming at us. We have this season every single year from the beginning of time, when hurricane season starts and when it ends. But we know it's coming.
I'll tell you, lieutenant governors and governors hold their breath a little bit when hurricane season is upon us, because sure, we could dig out if it was a Category 1 or 2 and there was some minor structural damage. 4 or 5 hits major infrastructure, we're gonna need help from the whole world.
And we know all that, yet we don't have any stockpiles, we don't have any supplies.
What the official policy is that you and I should have a 14-day supply of food and water in our house, because the state is not in a position to actually support us in the case of our exhausting our existing in-state food reserves.
We don't have any emergency medical supplies stocked either. So there's no food, there's no water, there's no medical supplies, which we found out with COVID there was no medical supplies. We don't even have a mask in stock.
That I found to be shocking, that the official state policy is, in essence, you are on your own. You and your family are on your own. You must have a 14-day supply of food and water in your house because we cannot guarantee that we can support you in the case of a natural disaster.
You could probably expect maybe 5 to 10% of the people in the state may have that kind of supply to get by for 2 weeks, but that means 90 to 95% don't. Sure, maybe everybody's good for 3, 4, 5 days, but after that it becomes enormously problematic. And we would see rioting, we would see desperate moves by people if we had that, that kind of threat to people's lives.
This facility is 8 feet above sea level. If I walk across the park and throw hard enough, I'll throw a rock in the ocean. That's how close we are. Every major distributor in Hawaii is along the coastline. Why? Because all our stuff comes from somewhere else. And so we're all near the ports because that's where our food comes from. We are broken and we don't know it because we're designed to be dependent on someone else, but not ourselves. You have distribution, you have the food, you have cold storage, you have power generation, and it's all up and down the coastline. The obvious concern is with a tsunami and a surge of a hurricane, that supply chain stops. That supply chain gets destroyed. It's one of the first things that gets destroyed. If the cranes go down on the port, Pearl, I believe, has 1 crane. You can't feed Hawaii on that. You can't feed this island on that. The next meeting we have is Lieutenant Governor meeting with all the grocers and so on. And so I immediately invited David, please come, everybody needs to hear what you're saying. This needs to go out everywhere, and that somebody's not screaming this is just absolute dereliction of duty if you're a leader in this state.
Well, when I heard it from David, it was because I kind of asked David, assuming that we would be very prone if we lost our capacity to bring in supplies. And it was shocking to hear how quickly we'd be in a desperate state. A lot of people think, oh, okay, we'd be okay for a couple months. No, we'd be only okay for a couple days.
And then shortly after that, we started having meetings. So now HIEMA's here, FEMA's here, city and county's here, Department of Emergency Management, days away from COVID rolling out. And so we're sitting around this conference table in this room, and one of the government agencies is just trying to get their head around, these are great people, don't get me wrong, these are amazing, hardworking, dedicated people. It's just never been on the list of to-do from leadership on down. One of the government people asks and says, after a hurricane, what food do you have left that we could confiscate and provide others with? And so, I immediately bristle with confiscate. That's a word I love, right? And so my question back was, what would you do with the food? I have the largest fleet of trucks. We've got 140 some drivers. We have the largest fleet of refrigerated, FSMA compliance, Food Safety Modernization Act compliant reefer trucks across all islands. We have warehousing with this food. We can get it wherever it needs to go. What's the state gonna do about it? What's the county gonna do about it? And the answer is nothing. There is no plan. There's no plan on the books.
Hopefully we will never have that Category 5 storm that not just comes through here, but also lands and hits and takes us out from an infrastructure standpoint. Hopefully it'll miss enough, but that's not a plan, that's not a policy.
The next question is, let me ask you a question now. Do you even have a phone tree of who to call? If the state needs food and there's people in need, the power's down, people lost what's in their refrigerator, you can't pump water to the reservoirs across the state to have running water. What's the plan that's on the books, or do you even know who to call? Other than me, because we just met in the last 30 to 60 days, Is there a phone tree? Is there any plan? Can you call the head of Waihata? Can you call the head of Cisco? Can you call the head of Safeway? All the people that the private industry deals with every day. And the answer is no. Not only is there no plan, there's no phone tree. And so what was beginning to take shape is we are all beginning to see we are in deep, deep trouble. And unless we take a collective action, we are literally racing towards disaster. And everyone from the top down has been asleep at the wheel.
To that point, Chad is completely correct. It's never been a priority for people that have come before me, honestly. I view things very differently because I kind of work in the trenches, live with people that are either near poverty or struggling, so I can see the impact on food security, housing security on them. So it's a priority more for me maybe than for some others.
All of our supply, if you want to be in business in Hawaii on the distribution side, you are absolutely operating 100% on just-in-time inventory, particularly when it comes to perishable, but that's on everything. So we're in the inundation zone. We're operating on just-in-time inventory. So when Hurricane Lane, Cat 5, parked off the south shore of Oahu, literally there was about 4 days of activity where everybody wiped out the grocers, clubs, and retailers. Bottled water is the first thing to go. Toilet paper, God knows why. But it all evaporates. Bakery goods, all that product is gone. So much so that when CNN and NBC and MSNBC and all the national news, when they reported on Hawaii, all they showed was the Cat 5 hurricane off the South Shore and grocery stores just wiped. And that was days before the hurricane hit. So there is no product in the stores, which means everything I have went there. And so we're empty, they're empty, and now the power's out because the storm hit. And so, people think that the food bank is our supply. All you need to do is drive across the street, also in the inundation zone, and there's the food bank in a much smaller facility than we have here that literally fills up and empties out just in time as well, and that's gone in an instant. Someone might say FEMA has some MREs. Well, the MREs are this. It's fewer than one per resident of Hawaii, so there's only 1 million and we've got 1 million plus. There's only one. It's responsible for the entire Pacific Rim. So everybody in Hawaii through FEMA gets their last supper, and now you're on your own. That's it. Find something to drink with that because we have no potable water, but you do get one last meal.
A lot of people do compare what happened or try to compare maybe the response of what went to Puerto Rico after Maria to what would come to Hawaii. And even, for instance, using the number of 100,000 meals a day that was delivered in Puerto Rico, that still means that 9/10 of our population isn't getting fed. That rotation of food basically on average gives everybody or one person a meal for every 3 days. And so when you look at things in that light, you're just keeping people alive. You're not getting work out of them. They're eating to stay alive. And that, of course, reduces your ability to recover.
You would have to try to figure out a more broken plan to keep Hawaii safe. I've said this now because this is become so real, particularly because of COVID. But the minute I can't take care of my own children, CPS, Child Protective Services, is going to come take them away. Yet there's no way on God's green earth that the state of Hawaii, any government agency, including federal, can take care of our people after a major natural disaster.
The experts tell us that we'll be hit probably more because of climate change and with greater frequency and the probability of more severe storms or greater intensity of storms. But we really only have to get hit by one, and it only has to be a Category 3 where we start really feeling these effects that we're discussing now.
Well, we've already had some of this experience because with COVID, we've seen a big surge in food insecurity. We've seen it go up to now 1 in 5 people in our state. That's essentially 250,000 people are food insecure. If we were to lose actual farms and lose the food supply, we'd be in deep, deep trouble.
So if you put these two things together, that we do not store much emergency or commercial food in the state, that we don't have the emergency management agencies articulated with the private sector food distribution networks, and we don't have many families that are storing that 14-day supply of food. In the case of a natural disaster, many families will go hungry.
With the cost of real estate, with the cost of utilities, with the cost of operating here in Hawaii, the entire industry, not just in Hawaii, but Hawaii makes it even more important that every distributor is working on a just-in-time inventory system. To give you an example of that, as you were watching our air freight team handle what was going on, that product came in and literally within 30 minutes was gone. It's no longer in our possession. It's going to market to get purchased, and there's more coming tomorrow. If you take a look at the ocean side of that, we ship out of the Port of Seattle, the Port of Oakland, the Port of LA, and the Port of Long Beach every week on every sailing. That's coming in. If one of those is late by a day, almost always, we will have to fly between the islands and start handling our inventory via air, because what's coming in twice a week is literally only to last until 3 to 4 days later when that next shipment comes in on the container lines. You take that really fragile, just-in-time system, there is no holding power. If you're holding power and you're not just in time, you're out of business. You know, all the businesses are running this way. All the grocers and clubs and retailers are on that same system, and there is no holding power. And so everything in Hawaii is just in time. Even more important now, knowing that we start growing and having inventories and systems and supply chains that are island-centric, island-developed for our people here. But when people just think there's just stockpiles of food somewhere at my warehouse or others, it's just pure fiction. There is none. Everybody's just in time.
We may stay lucky and keep dodging the growing hurricane threat to our broken food system. But within 30 years, climate change is going to cause food shortages anyway, and will be threatened again.